Unfiltered, unapologetic, and insightful, this is the Africa Program. From Morocco to South Africa, from Burkina Faso to the Congo, our lens is wide. We connect the dots and spark fearless conversations on politics, art, economics, and security. Join me, Mvemba Phezo Dizolele, founder and managing director of Dizolele Advisory, for fresh perspectives and voices from across the continent and beyond. Ghana always stands out in the history of modern Africa for the role that it's played from the time that the continent came into contact with the outside world. It was of course known as the Cape Coast and Gold Coast and so many coasts, Elmina Coast, many names depending on who you were talking to, what historians and what period. Ghana is also important and has continued to shape the imagination and scholarship of Africa because of one individual particularly, who is Francis Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first leader of that country into new configuration, the Republic of Ghana. Ghana became the first African country south of the Sahara to become independent in 1957, and in no part to Kwame Nkrumah himself and his colleagues. Kwame Nkrumah represents a man who straddles different worlds, the world of Africa where he was born, the United States where he studied, and London where he had engaged in different fashions. Today, we would like to talk about Kwame Nkrumah and what he came to represent through the work of our guest today, which is Howard French, who's a professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York and the former New York Times bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and China, where he based in Shanghai. He's the author of 6 books, and the last one that he had written before this one is called Born in Blackness, which kind of centered the role of Africa in the development of the world across the board. Today, we will be talking about his latest book, which is The Second Emancipation, Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism, and Global Blackness at High Tide. You can see a copy here. Emancipation, the word emancipation itself carries so much weight, so much luggage, and so much meaning. Howard French, welcome to the Africa Program. We appreciate you joining us today to talk about your book. And of course, and really to start, I'd like to say, why emancipation? Why Kwame Nkrumah? Why today? Kwame Nkrumah has been gone for a while.
It's wonderful to be with you again, Mvemba. We've known each other for a long time, and it's my second time speaking to you in a podcast type of forum. So thank you for having me back. These are very good questions to start with, and I'll take them in order. Why emancipation, or what is emancipation? What do I mean by emancipation in the book's title? A premise of this book is that colonization falls on the spectrum of domination and exploitation that began with enslavement and began with the transatlantic slave trade. And so certainly for Western audiences, the first emancipation is usually considered or understood to be the end of that trade. Trade is actually a euphemism. Let's just call it commerce. The commerce in human beings from Africa for the purposes of economic exploitation and conversion into chattel or bestial property. So the first emancipation is the end of that institution, which lasted a very long time, centuries across the Atlantic Ocean. The second emancipation is about the end of a newer form of domination, which is the domination constituted by imperialism and colonial control of the African continent. Why Kwame Nkrumah's story? How does he fit into this? As you said in the introduction, Kwame Nkrumah is the the person who has the single greatest credit, I think, for having pushed past the boundaries of colonial domination and shown the way for the rest of the continent, the way of freedom. And he did so from Ghana in 1957 after a long struggle, peacefully. He managed to break free from the world's greatest empire of the time, the United Kingdom. And this is an extraordinary story that not only fired the imaginations of the rest of the African continent, which it did, and served as a catalyst for independence movements all across the African continent in very short order, but also fired the imaginations of African Americans in the United States. And this leads to the third piece of your opening question: why today? The reason for this today, and my answer to your question about why is Kwame Nkrumah so little remembered or spoken about today, is precisely a response to my feeling of lamentation or regret or even dissent against the forgetfulness that we have in the West. I don't just mean we as Black people, I mean everyone, for this high watermark of the 20th century in which a man from Africa led a movement of liberation in Africa that also played an extraordinarily important role in inspiring African Americans, spurring them on in their own parallel and concurrent struggle in the mid-20th century for full citizenship rights, a second emancipation also, if you will, in the United States for Black Americans. And so it's, anyone who reads the book will, I think, be astounded by the degree of recognition and even prominence that Kwame Nkrumah had in the United States in the 1950s during that period of the civil rights struggle, and especially impressed when one thinks about that in contrast to the degree to which Kwame Nkrumah has dropped out of our contemporary consciousness, any sort of present day thought about the world or how we got to the place we find ourselves today.
Important element that you raise, Howard. The emancipation in the United States, the emancipation in Africa, both through different systems that are tied, right? There's the slavery, kind of the dehumanization and so on. And colonialism happened just to be the extension of that on the other side. Or as you demonstrated in Born in Blackness, it's actually one feeding the other, and then it's a virtual circle. So as we were, when I was a kid growing up in Zaire at the time, the triangular trade, as it was called, la traite des Noirs. But in the decolonization process, Kwame Nkrumah, as you outline in the book, benefit from his exposure to the United States as well, because he does come to America. The conscientization cannot be understated. Can you talk a little bit about how his exposure to the politics of the United States, at least attending Lincoln University in Pennsylvania? This is still the 50s and the 60s, so things are not particularly rosy for his kinship across the Atlantic.
Well, Nkrumah attends Lincoln University in the 1930s, actually. But let me start his story in the beginning. So he's born in 1909 in the far southwestern corner of coastal Ghana, very close to the border with Ivory Coast. His people, a very small ethnic group known as the Nzima, were straddled on both sides of the border. And so Kwame Nkrumah, this is a really extremely neglected part of the Gold Coast, a British colony that's right next door to a French colony called the Ivory Coast. This plants a seed in Nkrumah that becomes very important later in his life when he understands the sinister effects of balkanization, the random way in which borders were drawn up for the African continent, not taking into account or consideration any prior African history or political organization of Africans among themselves, had tremendously deleterious effects going forward. That this was a kind of imposing a hidden penalty on Africans that they had been balkanized in this way without any agency of their own. So this is the start of this remarkable Nkrumah story. The British had invested almost nothing in terms of the development of the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was, as I document in the book, a tremendously lucrative colony for Britain. In fact, getting toward the middle of the 20th century, by that time, the Gold Coast was the second biggest cash earner for Britain of all of its colonies. It trailed only Malaysia in terms of its generation of hard currency. And the reason why it generated so much hard currency was because as Ghana has been since the Ghana Empire of more than 1,000 years ago, a big source of gold, and then much more recently, because Ghana, during Nkrumah's lifetime, was the world's largest source of cocoa, which is where we get chocolate from. And so Britain was making enormous profits from Gold Coast and putting no money back into the Gold Coast. And Nkrumah grew up, or was born, in one of the more impoverished regions of the Gold Coast. And his story is kind of limned by, or marked by, I guess as any remarkable person's life must be, tremendous coincidences. So he is the only child of his mother, who is a so-called junior wife of his father. He had several wives, and there are many children older than him, but his mother convinces his father somehow. His father is not a wealthy man. He's a petty gold trader or a jewelry trader, to send Kwame to school. And so Kwame Nkrumah goes to school in a Catholic missionary school in the far southwest of Ghana. It was the Gold Coast, of course, then. He gets noticed by a colonial administrator who tours the region. This administrator sends him to, or invites him, the family, to send him to Accra, where for the first time in the 1920s or the late teens, the first academy or real high school built by the British was being created. So listen to that. Ghana is one of the most important sources of wealth for Britain, and they're only now getting around to building a real school at the academy level for the country. Okay, Kwame Nkrumah, by this string of coincidences, enters into the first class of this academy. He falls under the influence of a couple of truly remarkable people. Another big coincidence: Nnamdi Azikiwe, a Nigerian newspaper editor at the time, who would become in the future Nigeria's first president, is a big influence on Nkrumah. He's writing crusading editorials about the urgency of independence and the scandal of colonial domination. Azikiwe is under the influence of Marcus Garvey, who was one of the grand figures of Black nationalism in the 20th century. And so these are formative influences on Nkrumah. Secondarily, or simultaneously, one of the assistant schoolmasters of this academy is named James Aggrey, a Ghanaian, and he also has come under the influence of Garvey. And Aggrey and Azikiwe had both studied in the United States. Aggrey had been to Columbia University. Azikiwe had been to Lincoln University. Britain trained very, very few people from the Gold Coast at a higher level, even at a high school level, but the exceedingly small numbers of people who did go overseas to study for university almost always went to Britain. These were two rare exceptions, and they both Nkrumah fell into both of their worlds, and they influenced Nkrumah to go to the United States to study instead of going to Britain. They did this partly not just because of their own experience, but because they felt that the British trained Africans to become subjects, that they trained them with a certain sense of history that was self-justifying and providing a rationale for British domination. Whereas if you went to the United States, a Black person or a person from Africa would likely be exposed to a much wider range of ideas and sensibilities. Azikiwe writes a recommendation letter to Lincoln University for Nkrumah, Nkrumah sets off for the United States in 1935. Really impressively intelligent already. He had thought maybe he would become a Jesuit priest up until that point in his life. An ambitious learner, very curious mind, but still a rather naive person. On the ship across the Atlantic from the UK to New York, he makes friends with a man from the Netherlands. And when they land in New York, the first few days in the United States, before Nkrumah gets to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, they're touring Harlem in 1935. Harlem is a place that's sort of alive with all kinds of intellectual currents and Black internationalist politics. People who are followers of Marcus Garvey, people who are followers of communism, people who are followers of American versions of Islam, and many, many other kinds of movement. And Nkrumah is seeing these soapbox orators and things like that all over Harlem, and this begins to agitate his mind. But in an example of his naivete, the Dutch guy says, let's go to a church. And he takes Nkrumah to the Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of the most famous Black churches in the United States. And Nkrumah is kind of horrified when he again came out of a Catholic Jesuit kind of tradition, when he sees African Americans getting very emotional and being very demonstrative in their worship in a Baptist kind of way. And Nkrumah expresses embarrassment to the Dutch guy, like, I'm sorry you had to see this. Like, this is giving you a low opinion of us Black people. And the Dutch guy said, no, calm down. This is actually wonderful. You should appreciate this. This is fantastic. I'm so happy we saw this. So I'm telling this story partly in response to your question, but partly also to kind of illustrate the distance that Nkrumah traveled in terms of his personal development and in terms of his own imagination and sense of identity. This is the beginning of Nkrumah's entry into a world of global Blackness. If you're from Ghana or from Congo or from Tanzania or from Senegal, you don't grow up in the 1930s thinking about Blackness. Everybody's Black around you. Blackness is the normal state, right? But if you come across the Atlantic in that era and you're encountering a society dominated by white people and seeing how do Black people fit in within that world, and how do they emphasize and celebrate their Blackness, this is a revelation. Like, they can't take their Blackness for granted. Everybody's not Black in their environment. And so there's a political aspect to Blackness that Nkrumah is being introduced to through these experiences. And the church, this first time in a Baptist church, becomes a kind of milestone in his personal development. He goes on to Lincoln University. We can talk more about that. Lincoln University was the first historically Black college or university in the United States. It was the first to have graduate studies. It had people like Thurgood Marshall and Langston Hughes, who had been graduates a decade or so before Nkrumah arrived there. Azikiwe had himself been a student of Lincoln and had taught at Lincoln. And so this is a second place where Nkrumah's sense of Blackness being a global thing as opposed to just a kind of secular African thing begins to dawn in him. And this sets him on his way as a figure who is an avatar of what I call in the title and subtitle of Global Blackness.
So we've weaved the Du Bois of the world, the Garveys, the Exposure, the Langston Hughes. Nkrumah is a young man in the 30s. Thanks for the correction there. He is soaking this experience, right? Is soaking this experience. Those of us who grew up in Africa, of course, agree with you. You don't become Black until you leave Africa. Otherwise it's not an issue. There's no issue of identity, this, identity, that, not in terms of color, at least. So until you go to Europe, you come to the US, then you're like, not only you become Black, but you become African. Before that, you were just whatever you were. You were not even an African. So Nkrumah experienced this. Then he goes home, and how does he embrace this entire notion of Pan-Africanism? Here I would like to push you a little bit, because you were in Africa in the 80s, the late 70s, after you finish your own education and start engaging. it's still a period of turmoil in Africa. You still have coups, you still people, riot and so on. And quickly after that, to have kind of the second wave of quote unquote democratization. But the word Pan-Africanism, whether it's a word or concept, fluctuates between pie in the sky, depending where people stand, to a dead concept today. So how does Nkrumah come into that space? How does this evolve? In the book, I think on page 409, Studying in That Space, there in the 400, you start talking about the OAU and how this clash of concept comes between the likes of Haile Selassie and Nkrumah himself. What does Pan-Africanism? Does it mean we're going to become the United States of Africa, as we often hear people say? Or does it mean a conscientization of sorts?
Well, I mentioned Garvey in terms of being an influence on Nkrumah via Azikiwe and via Agre before he ever left Africa. So Garvey had a big impact on these two mentors, early mentors of Nkrumah. This was really instrumental in forging what would become Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism. The next stage happens in the United States, especially as he's studying in Lincoln University. He accumulates four degrees in basically 5 years, which is to give you a measure of the intellectual ambition and talent that he had. And he begins to do a whole variety of things. One of them is he's poor. He can't pay his tuition, doesn't have funds for tuition, so he has to do a variety of things to get by economically and to pay his bills. He begins to preach, actually, in Baptist and Methodist churches in the Mid-Atlantic, and he learns another side of blackness through that. He's going to black churches in Philadelphia and Baltimore, various, in that Mid-Atlantic region, and understanding American expressions of blackness. And also some of these congregations also had international worshipers as well. But then the next big step for him was beginning to visit Howard University in the 1930s and early 1940s. And Howard University, it's really hard to overstate how in this era, Howard University was a true citadel of global blackness, of global black intellectual life. It assembled a roster of some of the most impressive black intellectuals of the 20th century, people like C.L.R. James and Eric Williams and Ralph Bunche and Thurgood Marshall, and on and on and on and on. Just extraordinary names. And Nkrumah, George Padmore, Nkrumah falls under the influence of these people. And this idea of Pan-Africanism is bubbling in that world already at this time. It's not new. As I said, Garvey had preached a version of Pan-Africanism. The Harlem Renaissance had celebrated a version of black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, of course. And so Nkrumah's kind of bathing in this. And then he goes off to, in 1945, he leaves the United States. So he spent a decade in the United States. He goes to Britain thinking he's going to go to law school. And he falls in very quickly into the African student world in the UK and enters into kind of what I'll call radical independence politics. He begins militating in rallies and student gatherings and small African student organizations for agitating for African independence. He falls under the sway of a guy, a name I just mentioned, George Padmore, who by this time is living in the UK, a man from Trinidad originally, who is one of the most energetic and resourceful political organizers that I know of anywhere in the world from the 20th century. Padmore has created a kind of clearinghouse of journalism about independence, where he's sending newsletters and contributions to newspapers all over the black world, sort of spreading in the church, in the Christian church. There's this phrase, the good news. That's what gospel means, right? He's spreading the gospel of independence, like writing things for little African or Caribbean or Black European or even Latin American newspapers all over the place. And he recruits Nkrumah to help him. And one of the things they're doing is being in touch with kind of nascent sort of preliminary kind of early stage independence groupings in all of these places. And Nkrumah so much impresses Padmore that Padmore names Nkrumah to be the secretary of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which was held in Manchester in 1945. And at this Congress, Nkrumah rubs shoulders with the next great name in the story, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois has been promoting Pan-Africanism himself since the early 20th century, along with all kinds of African-American intellectuals, British intellectuals, and people like Diagne, who from Senegal.
Blaise Diagne, yeah.
And so this is the next sort of eye-opener for Nkrumah. And many things happen before he gets back home in Ghana, many also of them sort of accidents of biography and coincidences of personal experience. But he arrives in Ghana in 1947 already with the message that now is the time. We have to make this push for independence, and that independence cannot be meaningful if it's just for Ghana. It has to be for all of the African continent, and that independence, and here I'm coming to your question, sorry, but independence for Africa will be meaningless unless independence for Africa is linked to the idea of Pan-Africanism, which means two things. Pan-Africanism, as Nkrumah understood it, meant forging common cause and confederation among Africans on the one hand, and on the other hand, building bridges to the real bridges to the African diaspora and sustaining energies across these divides, meaning that Africans and African Americans and Afro-Brazilians and Afro-Europeans had to be drawn together in one global project of blackness, and that this constituted the best remedy and recipe, if you will, for liberation and for economic wholeness for Africans in a hostile world. That the only way really to protect the rights of this huge portion of humanity, Africa and the African diaspora, a huge portion of humanity, but a subjected one, the only way to protect them and to advance their interest was by forging common cause together. That is what Pan-Africanism, as Nkrumah understood it, meant. And you say, I don't remember your exact wording, but you said something to the effect that this is kind of, in the eyes of some, this is kind of an old-fashioned or discredited or maybe faded ideal. Perhaps that's true, perhaps not, right? I know, African-American elites in this country political elites in this country don't spend a lot of time talking about Pan-Africanism. African political elites, for the most part, with a few notable exceptions, don't spend a lot of time giving speeches about Pan-Africanism, or let's put it differently. They don't put a lot of energy into practically advancing Pan-Africanism. They may allude to it in their speeches, but they don't do much about it, right?
Correct. That's what I meant. Is it become a slogan, or is it what? That's why I wanted to come to you and flesh it out.
But I think Pan-Africanism has lost none of its potency as an idea. And I really mean that, none of its potency. I think if you talk to people at the grassroots level in the United States, in Brazil, where I have researched my books, across the African continent and among people of African descent in Europe, at the grassroots level, the interest in, the warmth toward, the enthusiasm for the idea of a Pan-African identity and of a power to be achieved in realizing this dream remains very vibrant, remains really alive. It is the leaders and the elites in these respective places who have failed to get the message and have failed to figure out a way to devise a real program of Pan-Africanism.
That's how it would lead us to the OAU. Because as you frame this, we can only think about, okay, Kwame Nkrumah becomes prime minister, president, so 1957, he leads his country to 1966. In between, many other countries become independent. There's, of course, the crisis of Congo. There's the crisis that continue to emerge in places like Northern and Southern Rhodesia and the Republic of South Africa. You have had a crisis. By crisis, I mean the fight for independence. Of course, they often generate into something else as the imperialists resist. So he's among the founding fathers of the OAU. How's that project, the Pan-Africanism project, translate into the OAU? And what are the fault lines, if any, or the centers of friction between the various leaders themselves? It's good to fight colonialism because it was clear there's a common project here, at least in the short term.
First of all, the OAU is itself an expression of Pan-Africanism. The OAU is born out of the idea of Pan-Africanism. Okay? I'm not saying the OAU succeeded. I'm not assessing its effectiveness, but the OAU itself is a realization of the dream of Pan-Africanism. Without Pan-Africanism, there's no OAU. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that Nkrumah is in many ways a victim of his own success, or his conception of Pan-Africanism is a victim of its own success. Nkrumah did not just talk up Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah takes power in 1957. In 1958, Guinea becomes independent under very turbulent and, for me personally, revolting circumstances. Charles de Gaulle had concocted a plan for France's colonies in West Africa, in which he said, listen, follow me, we'll all get behind France and be part of a common union in which France is the senior partner and you guys are the junior partners, and you can have your flags and be called independent nations, but you're really kind of still under the dominion of France, and that we will protect you and we will manage your foreign affairs and we'll manage your economic, your treasury and various other crucial dossiers, right? And to pull this off, de Gaulle organized or commanded that his colonies organize referendums, and Guinea voted no, famously. And de Gaulle and the French punished Guinea. For its temerity. He had all of the French coopérants, kind of aid workers, the government bureaucrats who sent to kind of run colonial affairs in the French possessions. He pulled them out of Guinea overnight. We're talking about doctors in hospitals. We're talking about doctors and nurses. We're talking about teachers in schools. We're talking about technicians who made the phone system work or who ran the ports. He repatriated them virtually overnight. They literally ripped out the telephone lines and smashed light bulbs and burned bureaucratic records and things like this as a punitive gesture to show what happens. Look, we, the French, in our grandeur and generosity, offered you a deal and you rejected it. So there's a price to pay for rejection. You've embarrassed us. And so this is what the kind of the exercise in self-indulgence and arrogance that France conducted in the wake of being rejected in this referendum. Kwame Nkrumah, in his most important early gesture in Pan-Africanism, said, we're going to support Guinea. We're not going to let Guinea flounder as it enters into independence under this punitive regime. Guinea becomes independent 1 year after Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah then provides $10 million of his brand new country's treasury to keep the Guinea government afloat. So Kwame Nkrumah is not a lip service man. He's not somebody who's just blah, blah, blahing about Pan-Africanism. Right from the outset, he's a Pan-Africanism dyed in the wool, in thought and in gesture, right? Kwame Nkrumah builds a radio service, The Voice of Africa, which says, we are going to compete. We, as an independent African country, are going to compete with the Voice of America, with the Voice Radio France, with Radio Moscow, with Radio Peking. We are going to show that Africans can have their own sense of understanding about the affairs of the world. And we are going to, he built transmitters that could reach every corner of the African continent with this message. and transmitted in multiple African languages and European languages. So this is a guy who's walking the walk of Pan-Africanism. He begins to experiment in many other gestures of Pan-Africanism, and I don't want to jump to the Congo too quickly, but, Congo becomes independent under turbulent circumstances of its own in 1960. Nkrumah sends some of the world's very first peacekeepers to the Congo in an effort to push back against Belgium's attempt to derail Patrice Lumumba and Congolese independence. Nkrumah pays a huge price for all of this. He sends Ghana's army to the Congo out of the spirit of Pan-Africanism. Now to your question. I say Pan-Africanism is a victim of its own success. Pan-Africanism is a victim because in pushing for independence, in lighting the path toward independence for other African countries, mind you, Guinea, 1958, 17 other sub-Saharan African countries in 1960 become independent. Suddenly, the United Nations is becoming, the General Assembly is becoming an African body almost. The number of African countries who are entering the United Nations is changing the very tenor and nature of the political life of the organization, right? The victim part of the success is that with each new independence, new elites are taking power in these countries. And with new power, elites very often succumb to the temptations of their privilege and their position. Being a new president or a new minister, living in a new state house, having a new diplomatic service, having your own limousines, having people cater to you, having the opportunity of tilting the playing board of the country's economic life to favor your own clan or your family or your region or whomever is something that is very hard. It takes a very special person to completely resist that, right? And so these kinds of dynamics really begin to take hold in these newly independent countries, and that brings them to kind of turn a deaf ear to the notion of Pan-Africanism, or just only to give lip service to it. Because to be real, Pan-Africanism requires surrendering some of your power as the leader of an individual state. It requires sacrifice, just as Nkrumah gave $10 million to Guinea, just as Nkrumah, trained independence forces for a variety of African countries, just as Ghana sent doctors and teachers to other Africa. It requires sacrifice to do this thing. But the failure and success part means in country after country, these new elites become wrapped up in captured by a dynamic of self-service, of profiting from their own privileged positions, and turning a back toward this ideal of Pan-Africanism. So they arrive in Addis Ababa in 1963 for the first OAU summit. And you asked about where were the fault lines, what were the big divides. The first obvious divide is between French-speaking Africa and English-speaking Africa. Putting Guinea aside, most of the French countries were still maintain a strong set of ties and allegiances to France.
They voted in 58 to stay in the Union, the union that Sékou Touré objected to.
Correct. And so these were never going to be people who were going to be inclined. France saw Pan-Africanism as a threat to its neo-colonial empire. This is very clear. And France worked very hard to militate or to agitate against any acceptance of Nkrumah's politics, right? And so the first big divide was the French countries. And there, much of West Africa is French, right? And so all of those countries, except Guinea, were already arrayed against Kwame Nkrumah's politics in the OAU founding conference. Many other countries, Nigeria, for example, also opposed Nkrumah's vision of federation, or of working toward, not overnight, but working toward creating a regional and ultimately Pan-African government. And the Nigerians very different from these French colonies, were proceeding not just from the sense of here are new elites with thirsts and appetites of their own, many times selfish. Not only did they have that, but the Nigerians had a grand sense of themselves. And I understand this. Nigeria is Africa's biggest country, demographically speaking. It was then as well. The Nigerians are filled with this attitude of, who is this guy, Kwame Nkrumah, leading a much smaller country, pretending to be the guy who's going to channel all of us into some kind of big organization. Like, surely this must be about just his own thirst for power. That was sort of the Nigerian discourse about this. So the French countries are against him. The Nigerians are against him. Various other people were much more sympathetic to him. The Zambians were sympathetic to him. The Tanzanians were sympathetic to him. The Ethiopians were sympathetic to him to different degrees. But the sort of most poetic expression of the tragedy involved here, for me, is the way that Julius Nyerere, the first leader of Tanzania, dealt with this. He was sort of skeptical early in his political life toward Kwame Nkrumah. East and West Africa in this era were not only physically separated at great distance, but had very little common sense of each other. They were no linguistic ties, no political traditions uniting them. There had been as colonies, no real contact. And so they looked at each other askance, right? Not being closely associated, right? Julius Nyerere was like that toward Nkrumah early on. Later in life, comes to see Nkrumah as the greatest African there has ever been. But he is tempted to listen to Nkrumah's ideas at this 1963 conference, but basically he realizes that it's not going to be practically possible to take a big step toward any kind of federation, and has a candid conversation with Nkrumah about this, and tells Nkrumah, it's better to accept baby steps than it is to do nothing. And Nkrumah, according to Nyerere, we don't know from Nkrumah himself what this conversation was like, but according to Nyerere, Nkrumah insists that if they don't make a big step toward, a big gesture toward at least eventual unification in 1963, then it will probably never happen. And I must say that Nkrumah so far has been proven right by history. Okay, so the 63 conference did not embrace Pan-Africanism in a political Pan-Africanism. And in fact, very little progress has been made toward this vision ever since then.
Today, in the world we live in today, the forces that shape that movement, the same forces that shaped the first emancipation and the experience that Kwame Nkrumah experienced, went through when he was in the US, are still with us. They've not changed. There's certain things that have shifted a little bit. So one influence we've not talked about Nkrumah is Nasser. Gamal Nasser in Egypt, who played a major role. I don't know if we call him a big brother or whatever role he did, including facilitating Kwame Nkrumah's marriage. Kwame Nkrumah was married to an Egyptian woman. So how relevant is Kwame Nkrumah's legacy or his views? Or maybe we should ask, what is Kwame Nkrumah's legacy today? And what should the greater Africa take from that?
So these are two very different topics. Let me just address the Nasser question first. So Nasser, and Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African colony to enter independence, as we've said. But things have been happening along those lines already in North Africa, most specifically in Egypt, which Egypt has an odd history, but compared to the rest of Africa of colonization. But Nasser had been running Egypt as a strong nationalist figure already for several years by the time Nkrumah becomes the leader of Ghana. And Nasser is a big figure on the world stage. He's a kind of founding presence in the non-aligned movement. And this has a big influence on Nkrumah. I think Nkrumah's marriage was partly to an Egyptian woman, as you said, was partly intended or largely intended as a political signal to the entire continent that there's no such thing as white Africans and black Africans, that North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are largely artificial divides, and that Africa is the wholeness of Africa must be embraced and celebrated by Africans. So that's really important to note. But there were a lot of precursors to Ghana's independence. Egypt was an important one. India's was an important one. The Philippines was an important one. The politics of the Bandung Conference under Sukarno in Indonesia was a super important moment in terms of the evolving politics of the Global South, the kind of nationalism and the pan-nationalism of the Global South in this era. All of these forces really were shaping Nkrumah and his thoughts and movement toward independence and Pan-Africanism. Where is Pan-Africanism today? I think Pan-Africanism today is an idea that, as I said a few minutes ago, still I'm pretty sure captivates large numbers of Black people. I'm sure is popular among Black Africans. I'm sure is popular among African Americans. I'm sure, for having witnessed it, popular among Afro-Brazilians. Brazil has a very large Black population.
The largest African country, as we like to say.
Correct. But Pan-Africanism is an idea that African leaders have not caught up to yet. That doesn't mean it's dead. We don't know where history is going to take us. And in the world of today, the embers of Pan-Africanism are alive in places like the Sahelian states of West Africa, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, in particular, which have adopted a kind of Pan-African politics, a Pan-African rhetoric, a kind of revolutionary style, an anti-neocolonialism, all of which are legacies of Pan-Africanism, of the Nkrumah variety of Pan-Africanism. And so what this tells me is that, Pan-Africanism is a vocabulary. It's a syntax. It's a set of intellectual tools. It's a storehouse of ideas and of ideals that the continent's people and the world's Black people are waiting the African world's leaders to figure out how to assemble in a workable way. And that this is something that, far from being dead, lies pregnant in our present and perhaps awaiting to be born in the future.
We see this also, if I can complete what you studied, Howard, with the mobilization of the youth across the continent. And I love those those groups actually linked, whether it's Yanamar in Senegal, Ballet Citoyen, #this flag. So I think the various forms of this, les ébats, I would say, of this, these societies or these revendications, les revendications, as they would say in French, the demands. And I think maybe that the torch is being passed, or is being wrestled from the older generation, from the youth, by the youth, that's what I mean. And I think that happened in 1960, that happened in the Nkrumahs. They were the young then. I mean, they're the one who took the leadership. I remember, since we're talking about Nkrumah being in Ghana, and the young friend, an activist who's very committed to the idea of Pan-Africanism, came to see me and asked, why can't you guys do X, Y, Z? I mean, I'm younger than you are, but we're becoming also older than, there's always somebody who's younger. And he said, you guys should do X, Y, Z. I said, no, we don't have to do it anymore. Thank you for joining us. We would like to continue this important conversations. Please subscribe to the Africa Program podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you like to listen. Our analysis and reports are available online at www.dizolele.com. That is DIZOLELE.com. The Africa Program podcast is produced by Sarah Baker and Mvemba Phezo Dizolele. Until next time.